She didn't care who was watching. Kimberly slammed her tray down and stood between her manager and the crying boy he was yelling at. The diner froze. What no one realized was that the man in the corner, the one who just set his coffee down, was the boy's father and the most dangerous man in the city. By the time she got fired, he'd already decided her life was about to change forever. The lunch rush at Vincent's diner hit like a freight train at noon. Kimberly Wallace wiped down table 7 for what felt like the 100th time that shift, her lower back screaming in protest as she balanced 3 plates of meatloaf on one arm and a coffee pot in her other hand. The diner clattered and hummed with the sound of working-class America, forks scraping ceramic, the hiss of the grill, shouted orders bouncing off grease-stained walls, and the low rumble of conversation from truckers, construction crews, and office workers stealing an hour away from fluorescent-lit cubicles. She'd been slinging hash at Vincent's for nearly 3 years now, pulling doubles most weeks just to keep the lights on and her mother's medical bills from piling higher. The place wasn't glamorous, cracked red vinyl booths, a jukebox that only played half its songs, and a ceiling fan that wobbled like it might give up any second. But it was work, and work was survival. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had an associate's degree in business administration collecting dust in a drawer somewhere, but in a town where experience required meant more than education, she'd learned to smile through the exhaustion and pretend the tips mattered more than her dignity. That's when she heard it. A voice, sharp, cruel, and too loud, cut through the noise like a blade. "Kid, I said this booth is reserved." Kimberly's head snapped up. Across the diner, near the front window, her manager, Robert White, loomed over a small boy who couldn't have been more than 7. The child sat frozen in the booth, hands wrapped around a chocolate milkshake like it was the only solid thing in the world. His eyes were wan, glassy with the beginning of tears, and his shoulders hunched inward like he was trying to make himself disappear. "Hey," Kimberly said, her voice tentative as she approached. "Is everything okay here?" The boy didn't answer. He just stared down at the table, his lip trembling. "Everything's fine," Robert snapped without looking at her. "The kid's in a reserved booth. He needs to move." "He's just sitting quietly," Kimberly said, glancing at the boy. "He's not bothering anyone." Robert's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He'd been managing Vincent's for 6 months, ever since the old owner sold out to some corporate restaurant group, and every day since had been a masterclass in petty tyranny. "I don't recall asking for your input, Wallace." His voice dropped, laced with warning. "This booth was called in an hour ago, reserved. That means paying customers. Not some kid wandering in off the street without supervision." Kimberly felt something hot flare in her chest, something she usually kept buried under layers of politeness in fear of unemployment. "He's a child, Robert," she said, stepping closer. Her tray clattered onto the nearest table. "You don't talk to kids like that. Especially not what?" Robert leaned in, his breath sour with coffee and arrogance. "You think because he's got a milkshake, he's got money? Look at him. Probably snuck in when no one was looking." The boy flinched, and that was it. Kimberly moved without thinking, stepping directly between them. Her hand came to rest gently on the boy's shoulder. "He's in my section," she said, her voice shaking. "Not with fear, but with fury. And I'm not letting you bully him." For a moment, the diner went quiet. Not silent, but muted, like someone had turned the volume dial halfway down. A few customers glanced over. One older man in a flannel shirt paused mid-bite. Robert's eyes narrowed. "You're out of line." "No," Kimberly said quietly. "You are." "Then you're fired." The words landed like a slap. Kimberly's stomach dropped, but she didn't move. The boy clutched the hem of her apron with one small, shaking hand. She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped, because she felt it. A shift in the air, a presence. Someone was watching. Her eyes drifted past Robert's shoulder, toward the corner booth near the back. A man sat alone, still as stone. He wore a dark blue suit that looked like it cost more than her monthly rent, and his posture was relaxed. But there was nothing casual about the way his eyes tracked every movement. Dark eyes, cold, calculating. 2 other men flanked the booth, standing near the wall. They weren't eating, they weren't talking. They were just there, watching. The man in the blue suit tilted his head slightly. His gaze locked onto Kimberly's for just a heartbeat, then shifted down to the boy. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, recognition. Then, with the barest motion of his hand, he signaled. The two men at the wall stopped mid-step, as if he'd frozen them in place. Robert was still ranting, his voice shrill and indignant, but Kimberly barely heard him. The boy had turned his head slightly, just enough to peek past her legs toward the corner booth. His face changed. The fear drained away, replaced by something fragile and aching. Relief, the man in the blue suit rose slowly, buttoning his jacket with one hand. He moved with the kind of confidence that didn't need to announce itself. Every step was deliberate, controlled. The diner went quiet again, this time completely. Robert finally noticed. He turned, his rant dying mid-sentence. The man stopped 3 feet away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Is there a problem here? His tone was calm, even polite. But there was something underneath it, something sharp and unyielding, like a blade wrapped in silk. Robert stammered. No, Mr. Bellardice, I didn't realize. Clearly. Roy Bellardice's gaze slid past the manager like he was wallpaper. His eyes landed on the boy, and for just a moment, his expression softened. William, he said quietly, come here. The boy scrambled out of the booth and ran him, wrapping his arms around his father's leg. Roy's hand came to rest on his son's head, fingers threading gently through dark curls. Then his eyes lifted and locked onto Kimberly's. Thank you, he said. 2 words. Quiet. Absolute. Kimberly nodded, her throat too tight to respond. Roy's gaze shifted back to Robert, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. You're Robert White, manager here. It wasn't a question. Robert nodded, his face pale. Yes, sir, I apologize if there was any. Save it. Roy reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. He withdrew a single business card and handed it to Kimberly. Come see me tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Then he turned, his son still clinging to his side, and walked toward the door. The 2 men in suits followed without a word. The diner stayed silent until the black car outside pulled away from the curb. Robert turned on her, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. Get out, he hissed. You're done. Don't even bother cleaning out your locker. Kimberly stood there, still holding the business card, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down. Embossed in silver lettering, Roy Bellardice, Bellardice Enterprises, private consultations, by appointment only. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know it yet, but everything had just changed. Kimberly didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, a wobbly second-hand thing she'd bought for $20 3 years ago, and stared at the business card like it might suddenly explain itself. Outside, the pre-dawn streets of her neighborhood were silent, except for the occasional wail of a siren in the distance. Her phone buzzed. Another text from the landlord. Rent was 5 days late, again. She rubbed her eyes and looked around the cramped studio apartment. Peeling wallpaper, a radiator that clanked like it had grudges to settle, a sink that dripped no matter how tight she cranked the handle. This was her life. Small, fragile, barely held together. And now she didn't even have a job. Her mother's medical bills sat in a stack beside the card, each one stamped with red letters that screamed, past due. Chemotherapy didn't wait for paychecks, neither did electricity companies or grocery stores. She picked up the card again. Roy Bellardice, Bellardice Enterprises, 9 a.m. That's what he'd said. What did a man like that want with someone like her? The knock came at 6:47 a.m. Kimberly jerked upright from the table, her heart hammering. She hadn't even realized she'd dozed off. 3 more knocks, firm, deliberate. She moved to the window and pulled back the thin curtain. Her stomach dropped. A black car sat parked at the curb, sleek, expensive, and completely out of place in this neighborhood. 2 men in dark suits stood outside her door. No, 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 no. Her mind raced. Had she done something wrong? Was defending that boy illegal somehow? Was this another knock? Ms. Wallace? A voice called through the door, calm, professional. We're here on behalf of Mr. Bellardice. Her hand hovered over the deadbolt. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to pretend she wasn't home. But what would that accomplish? If they wanted to find her, they already had. She opened the door a crack, the chain still latched. One of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that revealed nothing, held up a phone. On the screen was a text message. "She'll be cautious. Let her know she's safe. RB." "Mr. Bellardice requests your presence this morning," the man said. "We're here to escort you." I can drive myself," Kimberly stammered. "He insists." It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't a suggestion either. What would you do? Get in the car with strangers or let the opportunity and maybe your last chance slip away? The drive into Manhattan felt like crossing into another universe. Kimberly sat in the back seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching as her neighborhood's crumbling bodegas and laundromats gave way to glass towers that scraped the sky. The men didn't speak, didn't even look at her. They simply drove with the kind of precision that suggested they'd done this 1,000 times before. The car pulled up to a high-rise wrapped in steel and darkened glass. A valet opened her door before she could reach for the handle. 43rd floor, one of the men said. "They're expecting you." The elevator ride was silent except for the soft hum of machinery. Kimberly watched the numbers climb, 20, 30, 40, and tried to steady her breathing. When the doors opened, she stepped into a reception area that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought marble and intimidation went hand in hand. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and the furniture looked like it cost more than her entire apartment building. A woman in a crisp white blouse appeared. "Miss Wallace? This way, please." Kimberly followed her down a hallway lined with abstract art and closed doors, each step echoing too loud in the silence. They stopped at the end. The woman knocked once, then opened the door. Roy Bellardice stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, staring out at the skyline. He didn't turn immediately. "Thank you, Monica," he said quietly. The door closed behind Kimberly with a soft click. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Roy turned. In the daylight, he looked different. Still imposing, still dangerous in that quiet, coiled way. But there was something else now, weariness maybe, or something close to it. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. She sat. He didn't. "I'm going to be direct with you, Miss Wallace," Roy said, his voice calm but weighted. "Yesterday you did something most people wouldn't have. You stood up for my son when you had every reason to walk away." Kimberly swallowed. "He was just a scared kid." "Exactly." Roy's gaze sharpened. "You saw a child, not an inconvenience, not a liability, just a child who needed someone." He moved to his desk and opened a folder. "I need someone like that. Someone with a spine. Someone I can trust." "Trust?" Kimberly's voice came out smaller than she intended. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." He slid a paper across the desk. "I'm offering you a position, personal financial assistant. You'll work directly with me, handle sensitive accounts, coordinate with department heads." Her eyes dropped to the paper. The salary line made her vision blur. 6 figures, annually, plus benefits, full medical coverage. It was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. This has to be a mistake," she whispered. "It's not." "But why me? I'm just a—" "You're more than you think you are." Roy leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "In my world, Ms. Wallace, loyalty is everything. Competence can be taught. Courage can't. Yesterday you showed me both." Kimberly stared at the contract, her mind spinning. This was insane. This didn't happen to people like her. But her mother's medical bills flashed in her mind. The eviction notice, the empty refrigerator. "What's the catch?" she asked. Roy's expression didn't change. "The catch is that once you're in, you're in. I don't do halfway. I don't accept betrayal. And I don't forget loyalty." His words hung in the air like a vow. She looked at the contract again. At the number that could change everything. Could you walk away from a lifeline even if you didn't fully understand where it came from? "Okay," Kimberly said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I accept." Roy nodded once. "Good. You start Monday." As she signed her name at the bottom of the page, she didn't notice the way Roy's jaw tightened, didn't see the weight he carried in the set of his shoulders. She'd just stepped into a world far more dangerous than she could imagine. And whether she knew it or not, she'd just become the only person Roy Bellardi's had trusted in years. The question was, would that trust save her or destroy them both? If you want to see how Kimberly's first day unfolds and what secrets she'll uncover, don't miss what happens next. Drop a like if you're hooked and subscribe so you don't miss a single twist. Kimberly's first day at Bellardi's Enterprises started with orientation paperwork, a security badge that required 3 levels of clearance, and an office on the 38th floor with a view that made her dizzy. It ended with a child's scream echoing down a marble hallway. She'd been reviewing financial statements, rows of numbers that would have made her accounting professors weep with joy when she heard it. High-pitched, desperate. The kind of sound that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. She was out of her chair before she'd made the conscious decision to move. The hallway was empty except for a woman in a gray suit standing outside a door marked private, her expression caught between concern and helplessness. "What's wrong?" Kimberly asked. The woman, Monica, the same one who'd escorted her earlier, shook her head. "It's William. He has episodes. Mr. Bellardi's is in a meeting and the nanny just quit this morning. I don't—" Another sound. Not a scream this time. A sob. Kimberly didn't wait for permission. She pushed open the door. The room inside was nothing like the rest of the building. Where everything else was steel and glass and sharp edges, this space was soft. Plush carpets, bookshelves lined with picture books and puzzles. A window seat overlooking Central Park. Toys scattered across the floor like abandoned soldiers. And in the center of it all, curled into a ball beside an overturned table, was William. He was smaller than she remembered, more fragile. His dark curls fell across his face and his whole body shook with silent, gasping sobs. Kimberly knelt slowly, keeping her distance. "Hey," she said softly. "Remember me?" The boy's head lifted slightly, his eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, fixed on her face. Recognition flickered, but he didn't speak. "It's okay," Kimberly continued, settling onto the carpet a few feet away. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted to make sure you were all right." William stared at her. His breathing was still ragged, but the sobs had quieted. She glanced at the overturned table. Crayons and papers scattered everywhere. One drawing had landed face up near her knee, a crude sketch of stick figures. She picked it up carefully. "Did you draw this?" A tiny nod. "It's really good." She studied it closer. 3 figures, one tall, one small, one with long hair. "Is this your family?" William's face crumpled. Fresh tears spilled down his cheeks, but still, no sound, no words. Kimberly's chest tightened. Monica had said episodes. Roy had mentioned his son in passing, clinical and brief, but no one had told her this, that the boy was drowning in silence. "Can I sit with you?" she asked. Another nod. She moved closer, close enough that William could reach her if he wanted, but not so close that she invaded his space. For a long moment they just sat there, her cross-legged on the carpet, him curled into himself like a question mark. Then slowly, William's hand reached out. His fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve. Kimberly stayed perfectly still. He tugged gently, then crawled forward and pressed himself against her side. His head came to rest against her shoulder, and she felt the dampness of tears soaking through her blouse. She wrapped one arm around him carefully, like he was made of glass. "It's okay," she whispered. "I've got you." Roy found them an hour later. Kimberly had gathered the scattered drawings and crayons, and she and William sat side by side at the small table, working on a new picture. He still hadn't spoken, but he'd stopped crying. Every few minutes he'd glance at her as if to make sure she was still there. Roy stood in the doorway, silent as a shadow. When Kimberly finally noticed him, she started to stand. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Don't." His voice was quiet, strained. "Don't apologize." He stepped into the room and William's head snapped up. For a moment, father and son just looked at each other, an entire conversation happening in the space between them. Roy's expression was unreadable, but Kimberly saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands flexed at his sides. Guilt, raw and unmistakable. "He hasn't spoken," Roy said, "since his mother died, 6 months ago." The words landed heavy. Kimberly looked down at William, who'd returned to his drawing with fierce concentration. I'm sorry, she said quietly. The doctors just say it's trauma, selective mutism. Roy moved closer, his voice dropping. I've hired specialists, therapists, nannies. They all say the same thing. Give him time. But time hasn't. He stopped, took a breath. He doesn't let people close anymore. Not even me. Kimberly's gaze shifted to the drawing William was working on. Her breath caught. It was a bridge, dark, angular lines stretching across the page. And beneath it, falling through jagged scribbles of blue, a figure with long hair. William, she said gently, pointing to the drawing. What's this? The boy's crayon froze mid-stroke. He looked up at her, then at his father. His mouth opened, closed. And then, in a voice so small it was almost a whisper, he said one word. Mama. The room went silent. Roy's face drained of color. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if afraid any movement might shatter the moment. Kimberly's heart pounded. She looked at the drawing again. The bridge, the fall, the dark water below. Something cold settled in her stomach. This wasn't just a picture. It was a memory. William's hand trembled as he set down the crayon. His eyes filled with tears again. But this time when he spoke, the words came out cracked and desperate. Mama didn't fall. The air left the room. Roy's expression shifted, shock giving way to something darker, something dangerous. Kimberly reached for William's hand, her mind racing. The boy had just spoken for the first time in 6 months, and what he'd said had just turned everything upside down. Roy knelt beside his son, his voice barely a whisper. What do you mean, William? But the boy had gone silent again, curling into Kimberly's side like she was the only safe harbor in a storm. And somewhere in the building below, Kimberly heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Whispered voices. The unmistakable click of a safety being checked on a concealed weapon. She was beginning to understand exactly what kind of empire she'd walked into, and the price of the truth might be more than any of them were ready to pay. Kimberly spent her first 2 weeks at Bellardice Enterprises learning the language of legitimate business, hiding illegitimate secrets. On the surface, everything was pristine. Real estate holdings, import-export ventures, a chain of high-end restaurants that included, she'd discovered with dark irony, Vincent's Diner. The numbers flowed like poetry, clean ledgers, documented transactions, quarterly reports that would pass any audit. But Kimberly had been trained to look deeper than surface narratives. And the deeper she looked, the less things added up. It started with a discrepancy in the third quarter expense report. Small, almost negligible. A $47,000 consulting fee that didn't match any contract in the system. She flagged it, thinking it was a clerical error. Then she found another, and another. By Friday of her second week, sitting alone in her office as the city lights flickered to life below, she traced a pattern that made her hands go cold. Millions of dollars, siphoned across 18 months, routed through shell companies with names like Riverside Development LLC and Harbor Consulting Group. The transactions were clever, small enough to avoid immediate attention, varied enough to seem legitimate, buried deep enough that most accountants would have missed them. But Kimberly wasn't most accountants. She pulled up the authorization signatures, cross-referencing them against the employee database. The name that appeared made her stomach drop. Robert White, Regional Operations Manager, her former manager, the man who'd fired her for defending William. He wasn't just some petty tyrant at a diner. He was embedded in Roy's organization, with access to financial systems and enough clearance to move money without raising flags. And he'd been stealing, systematically, for over a year. Kimberly sat back, her heart pounding. The offshore accounts traced to banks in the Caymans, Cyprus, Panama, places designed to hide money and the people who moved it. But Robert White wasn't smart enough to orchestrate this alone. Someone higher up had to be helping him. She printed the evidence, her hands shaking, and walked toward Roy's office. Roy listened in silence as she laid out the findings page by page. His expression remained perfectly neutral, the same controlled mask he wore in every meeting, every negotiation. But Kimberly had learned to read the small things, the way his fingers drummed once against the desk, the tightening at the corner of his jaw. When she finished, the silence stretched long enough to make her wonder if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. "How long have you known?" Roy asked finally. "I just finished tracing the last account an hour ago." "And you haven't told anyone else?" "No, just you." He nodded slowly, then gathered the papers and locked them in his desk drawer. "Good. Keep it that way." Kimberly blinked. "You're not going to—" "Fuck yet." His voice was cold steel. "If Robert White is dirty, he's not working alone. Whoever's protecting him has access to our internal systems. If we move too soon, they'll disappear." "But millions of dollars—" "I'm aware." Roy's gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something dangerous uncoil behind his eyes. "You did exactly what I hired you to do, Ms. Wallace. Now I need you to do one more thing. Say nothing. To no one. Understood?" It wasn't a request. "Understood," Kimberly whispered. She should have gone home. But at 8 p.m., still rattled and needing to clear her head, Kimberly found herself walking the empty 38th floor, past darkened offices and silent conference rooms. That's when she heard the voices, low, tense, coming from behind the half-open door of Roy's private study. She knew she should leave. Knew eavesdropping on Roy Bellardis was possibly the worst idea she'd ever had. But she stopped anyway. "Telling you something's off." The voice was unfamiliar, deep with a rough edge. "3 of our shipments were flagged by customs in 2 months. That's not coincidence." "I'm handling it, Dominic," Roy's voice, calm but with an undercurrent of warning. "Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like someone's feeding information to the feds." A pause. "And the timing lines up with when she started." Kimberly's blood went cold. "Careful." Roy's tone dropped to something lethal. "See, lethal. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You bring in some waitress off the street, give her access to our financials, and suddenly she found a leak you missed for 18 months. Silence, Wayne. "What leak?" Dominator's voice was sharp now. "The one I'm about to plug, permanently." Roy's chair scraped. "I trust her, Dominic, which is more than I can say for most people in this building." Trust is a dangerous game, Roy. Especially when you're trusting people you barely know. "Then it's a good thing I know exactly who I can't trust." The words hung like a blade. Footsteps approached the door. Kimberly moved fast, slipping into a darkened office across the hall just as the door swung open. Through the crack, she watched a man emerge, tall, silver-haired, with a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. Dominic Russo, Roy's right-hand man, the man she'd been introduced to her first day with a firm handshake and a smile that never reached his eyes. He paused in the hallway, his gaze sweeping the shadows. For one terrifying heartbeat, Kimberly thought he'd seen her. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. She waited until the elevator dinged before she moved, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dominic suspected her, thought she was a leak, a threat, and from the ice in his voice, she knew exactly what happened to threats in Roy Bellardis' world. But worse than that, far worse, was the creeping realization that if Dominic was involved in the stolen millions, if he was the one protecting Robert White, then she just painted a target on her own back. And the only person standing between her and a bullet was a mafia boss who'd known her for 2 weeks. Kimberly pressed her back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. Numbers didn't lie. But in this world, the truth could get you killed. The envelope appeared on Kimberly's desk on a Tuesday morning, unmarked and impossible to trace. She'd arrived early, before the secretaries, before the security shift change, a habit she'd developed since overhearing that conversation. The office was silent except for the hum of the HVAC system and the distant ding of elevators. The manila envelope sat centered on her keyboard. No address, no name, just the faint outline of photographs inside. Her hands trembled as she opened it. 6 photos spilled onto the desk. Surveillance shots, grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to make her blood run cold. Her apartment building, her walking to the subway, her mother's nursing home in Queens. And beneath them, a single sheet of paper with 7 words typed in block letters. "Leave before it's too late." The paper slipping from her fingers. Someone was watching her. Someone knew where she lived, where her mother was, Everywhere she went when she thought she was safe, the message was clear. Stop digging or pay the price. She was still staring at the photos when her office door opened without a knock. Dominic Russo stood in the doorway, a coffee cup in one hand, his expression pleasant, but his eyes cold and assessing. Early start? He asked. Kimberly's hand moved instinctively, covering the photos. Just catching up on some reports. Dedication, I like that. He stepped inside, uninvited. Though I have to wonder, what's so urgent it can't wait until business hours? Just being thorough. Thorough, Dominic smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You know, Roy's had a lot of assistants over the years. Most of them understood that some things are better left unexamined. The threat was paper thin. I'm just doing my job, Kimberly said, her voice steadier than she felt. Of course you are. He set his coffee down on her desk, right next to the envelope. His gaze flicked to it, then back to her face. Just remember, loyalty goes both ways in this organization. Roy trusts you. I'd hate to see that trust misplaced. He picked up his coffee and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Kimberly didn't move until his footsteps faded down the hall. Then she grabbed the photos, stuffed them back in the envelope, and shoved the whole thing into her bag. Her hands were still shaking. She found William in his playroom that afternoon, surrounded by books he wasn't reading and toys he wasn't playing with. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted. Relief, maybe? Or recognition that she was the one person who didn't treat him like he was broken. Hey, Kimberly said softly, settling onto the carpet beside him. Want some company? William nodded and immediately scooted closer, pressing against her side the way he always did now, like she was an anchor in a storm he couldn't name. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Kimberly tried to steady her breathing, tried to push away the images of those surveillance photos, but her mind kept circling back to the same question. Who sent them? Miss Kimberly? William's voice was barely a whisper. She looked down. He was clutching a small toy car, his knuckles white. What is it, sweetheart? I had a bad dream about Mama. Kimberly's chest tightened. Do you want to talk about it? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then in a voice that shook, she was crying. On the phone. She said she knew what he did. What who did? William's eyes filled with tears. The man with the gray hair. He came to our house. Mama yelled at him, told him to get out. Gray hair. Kimberly's pulse spiked. William, was it? Uncle Dominic. The name dropped like a stone. He told Mama she didn't understand, that it was business, but Mama said stealing is stealing. William's breath hitched. Then we went to the bridge. Mama said we needed to go somewhere safe, but Uncle Dominic was there too. Kimberly's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to stop him, wanted to protect him from reliving this, but she knew. This was the key to everything. What happened on the bridge, William? Tears streamed down his face. They were arguing. Mama was holding my hand. Then Uncle Dominic grabbed her arm and he broke down, burying his face in Kimberly's shoulder. She held him tight, her mind racing. Dominic had been there. The night William's mother died. They'd argued about money, about stealing, and now William's mother was dead. Millions were missing, and Dominic was circling Kimberly like a predator. It's okay, she whispered, even though nothing was okay. You're safe now, I promise. But even as she said it, she wondered if it was a promise she could keep. That evening, Roy summoned her to his office. She walked in to find Dominic already there, standing by the window with that same pleasant, poisonous smile. Ms. Wallace, Roy said, his tone unreadable. Dominic has raised some concerns about your recent activities. Kimberly's stomach dropped. I'm simply suggesting, Dominic said smoothly, that someone with Ms. Wallace's limited experience might be misinterpreting certain financial patterns, making accusations without understanding context. I haven't made any accusations, Kimberly said, forcing herself to meet Roy's gaze. I reported discrepancies. That's my job. Your job, Dominic countered, is to assist Roy, not to conduct unauthorized investigations that could compromise sensitive operations. Roy's expression remained stone. Is there something you'd like to tell me, Ms. Wallace? This was it. The test. She could back down, apologize, pretend she'd been mistaken, or she could tell the truth and hope the man who'd trusted her 2 weeks ago would trust her now. Kimberly took a breath. Your son told me something today. About the night his mother died. Dominic's smile vanished. Roy leaned forward, his voice deadly quiet. What did he say? He said she didn't fall. Kimberly's gaze shifted to Dominic. He said she was arguing with someone about stolen money. The temperature in the room plummeted. Roy's eyes locked onto Dominic. Is that true? The boy's traumatized, Dominic said quickly. He doesn't know what he's saying. You can't possibly answer the question. For the first time since Kimberly had met him, Dominic Russo looked afraid, and she realized she'd just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The only question now was whether she'd survive it. Kimberly knew something was wrong the moment she arrived at work and found her security badge wouldn't scan. She stood at the entrance to the 38th floor, watching the red light blink mockingly on the card reader, while a security guard she'd never seen before checked his tablet with bureaucratic slowness. Ms. Wallace, he said finally, you'll need to come with me. What? Why? Mr. Bellardice's orders. Her stomach twisted. Is William okay? The guard's expression didn't change. This way, please. The walk to Roy's office felt like a funeral procession. Employees who normally greeted her now averted their eyes. Whispers followed her down the hallway like ghosts. When she reached Roy's office, the door was already open, and Dominic Russo was inside, standing beside Roy's desk with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just won a game she hadn't known she was playing. Roy sat behind his desk, his face carved from granite. On the surface in front of him, a stack of documents, printouts of bank statements, and her employee file. Sit, Roy said. It wasn't a request. Kimberly sat, her pulse hammering in her throat. Roy slid a document across the desk. Explain this. She picked it up with shaking hands. It was a transfer authorization, $750,000, moved from a Bellardice Enterprises holding account into an offshore account in the Caymans. Her signature was at the bottom, her employee ID number, her authorization code. I didn't do this, she said immediately. The system logs say otherwise. Dominic's voice was silk over steel. Your login credentials, your workstation, transferred 3 days ago at 11:47 p.m. I wasn't even here at 11:47. I left at 6 that night. The security logs will show. Security logs can be adjusted, Dominic interrupted smoothly, especially by someone with financial system access. Kimberly's mind raced. This was it, the move she should have seen coming. Dominic hadn't just planted doubt, he'd manufactured evidence. Roy's expression remained unreadable. There's more. He slid another document across. Bank statements, an account in her name, one she'd never opened, showing deposits totaling over $1 million across the past 6 weeks. Her vision blurred. These transactions correspond exactly with the discrepancies you discovered, Dominic said, his tone almost gentle. It appears you were creating a trail to cover your own theft. Brilliant, really. Report the crime you're committing to establish credibility. That's insane, Kimberly whispered. Roy, you know me. I would never... Do I? Roy's voice was cold, empty. I've known you for 3 weeks, Miss Wallace. 3 weeks. Dominic has been with me for 20 years. The words hit like a physical blow. She looked at Roy, really looked at him, searching for some sign of the man who'd offered her a second chance, who'd trusted her with his son, who'd listened when she'd uncovered the truth. But his face was a mask. This was a test. She realized it with sudden crystalline clarity. He was waiting to see what she'd do, how she'd react. She could cry, beg, plead for him to believe her, or she could give him something Dominic couldn't, the truth. Kimberly set down the forged documents, her hands steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. If you trust me even an inch, she said quietly, check for yourself. Roy's eyes narrowed slightly. My workstation, my computer. Pull the hard drive. Check the metadata on those transfers. Check the IP addresses. She met his gaze head on. If I did this, the evidence will be there. If I didn't, you'll find the forgery. Dominic shifted. Roy, this is a waste of... I'm not finished. Kimberly's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room. I've worked in accounting long enough to know that real embezzlers don't report their own crimes. They bury them. They hide them. I brought you evidence of theft because I thought you deserved the truth. She stood slowly, maintaining eye contact with Roy. So here's what I'm offering. Full access. My apartment, my bank accounts, my entire life. If you find one shred of real evidence that I stole from you, I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. The silence stretched like razor wire. Roy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Something flickered behind his eyes. Doubt, maybe, or calculation. Then his expression closed again. Escort Ms. Wallace out of the building, and he said to the guard at the door, "She's relieved of her duties pending investigation." The words landed like a death sentence. "Roy," she started, "that's Mr. Bellardice to you." His voice was winter ice. "You're done here." The security guard stepped forward. Kimberly felt his hand on her elbow, firm, but not rough. She didn't resist, didn't cry, didn't fall apart. She walked out of that office with her head high and her spine straight, even as her world collapsed around her. Behind her, she heard Dominic's voice, low and satisfied. "I'm sorry it came to this, Roy. I know you wanted to believe in her." Roy didn't respond. As the elevator doors closed, Kimberly caught one final glimpse of the 38th floor. Through the glass walls of Roy's office, she saw him standing at the window, his back to Dominic. His shoulders rigid. He hadn't looked at the documents again, hadn't looked at Dominic. He just stood there, staring out at the city, his hands clenched at his sides. And in that moment, Kimberly understood something crucial. Roy Bellardice hadn't believed Dominic's evidence, but he couldn't show his hand, not yet, not while Dominic was watching. The question was whether she'd live long enough for Roy to uncover the truth, or whether Dominic's next move would be permanent. The elevator descended, and with each floor, Kimberly felt the weight of what she'd just lost. Her job, her safety, her only ally. But she hadn't lost herself. And if there was one thing growing up poor had taught her, it was this. When they knock you down, you get back up. Even if you have to crawl. Kimberly spent 3 days in her apartment waiting for the other shoe to drop. She disconnected her phone, stopped checking email, sat in the dark watching shadows crawl across her ceiling and wondering if Dominic would send someone to make sure she stayed quiet permanently. On the 4th day, someone knocked. She froze, her heart jackhammering against her ribs. 3 soft knocks, a pause, then 3 more. That pattern, she knew that pattern. William. She rushed to the door and looked through the peephole. A woman in a dark coat stood in the hallway, one of Roy's drivers. And beside her, clutching a backpack, was William Bellardice. Kimberly yanked open the door. "What are you?" "He insisted," the driver said quietly. "Mr. Bellardice doesn't know we're here." The boy said it was important. 5 minutes. William slipped past her into the apartment. The driver remained in the hallway, her hand resting meaningfully on something beneath her coat. Protection or threat? Kimberly couldn't tell which. She closed the door and knelt beside William. "Sweetheart, you can't be here. If your father finds out..." "Daddy's wrong." William's voice was small but fierce. His eyes were red-rimmed like he'd been crying. "Uncle Dominic lied. I know he did." "William, Mama kept secrets. Important ones." He unzipped his backpack and pulled out a tablet. Expensive, childproof. The kind wealthy parents bought to keep their kids entertained. She said if anything happened, I should keep this safe. That the truth was inside. Kimberly's breath caught. "What truth?" "I don't know. It's locked. But you're smart with computers. Mama said..." His voice cracked. "She said if I ever needed help, find someone brave. You're brave, Miss Kimberly." She took the tablet with trembling hands. The screen showed a password prompt. Bellardice Family Archives. Encrypted. "Did your mother tell you the password?" William shook his head, then quietly. "But she always used my birthday for important things." Kimberly tried it. The screen unlocked. Inside, folders. Dozens of them. Financial records, scanned documents, audio files. And one folder labeled, "Insurance. Do not delete." She opened it. Her blood turned to ice. The first file was a spreadsheet, a mirror image of the doctored transfers Dominic had used to frame her. But this version had something his didn't. Metadata showing the original creation date, the actual IP address, and the real user ID. Dominic Russo's credentials, not hers. The timestamps proved the documents had been altered 3 days before they had appeared on Roy's desk. Someone had created a forgery, backdated the logs, and planted evidence in systems Kimberly had never accessed. But the spreadsheet wasn't the worst of it. The audio file was. Kimberly clicked play and a woman's voice filled the room, cultured, frightened, and furious all at once. "You stole from him, Dominic. From your own family. It's not stealing. It's compensation for 20 years of loyalty." Dominic's voice. Unmistakable. Cold. "Roy's built an empire, and what do I get? A salary and a pat on the back? He trusted you. He's a fool, just like you." There was a sound, something slamming, a gasp. "You think you can threaten me? I know where everybody's buried, Elena. Literally. I have evidence, everything. If anything happens to me, then what? You'll go to the police? You're as dirty as the rest of us. Roy's wife, living off blood money, pretending your hands are clean. I'm taking William and leaving. Tonight." A pause, then quieter, more dangerous. "Family doesn't betray family, Elena. You taught me that. You betrayed us first." The recording cut to muffled sounds, a car engine, wind, distant traffic. Then Elena's voice again, shaking. "William, stay in the car. Mama needs to make a phone call." "Going somewhere?" Dominic's voice closer now. "Stay away from us." "Can't do that. You know too much." "Dominic, please." A scream, a crash, then silence. The file ended. Kimberly sat frozen, the tablet trembling in her hands. Beside her, William had gone pale, tears streaming down his face. "He pushed her," William whispered. "I saw him. On the bridge. He pushed Mama." Kimberly pulled him close, her mind racing. This wasn't just evidence of embezzlement. This was evidence of murder. And Dominic Russo had just tried to destroy the only person who could have uncovered it. She worked through the night, copied the files, cross-referenced the metadata, built an airtight case that even Dominic couldn't talk his way out of. Then she faced the hardest question: how to get this to Roy without Dominic intercepting it. She couldn't email, couldn't call, couldn't walk into Bellardice Enterprises without being arrested. Or worse. Then she remembered something. A throwaway comment from her second week. Roy mentioned he maintained a secure server for sensitive communications. Encrypted, anonymous, accessible only to him. She'd seen the access protocols in his office once while filing reports. It took her 2 hours to breach the firewall, not hacking exactly, but using her employee credentials that hadn't been fully deactivated yet. She uploaded everything: the spreadsheets, the metadata, the recording, and she included one message. "Family doesn't betray family, but Dominic did. He killed your wife, he framed me, and he's still in your office. The truth is in the files. Trust what you hear." KW. She hit send. Then she sat back, exhausted and terrified and strangely calm. Either Roy would believe her or she'd just signed her own death warrant. William had fallen asleep on her couch, clutching his backpack like a lifeline. Kimberly covered him with a blanket and stood at the window, watching the city lights blur through tears she hadn't let herself cry until now. She'd lost everything twice in 1 month, but this time, she wasn't going down without a fight. Somewhere across the city, in a high-rise office overlooking Manhattan, Roy Bellardice's phone chimed with an encrypted notification, and the truth finally began to surface. The call came at 6:47 a.m., a blocked number. Kimberly almost didn't answer. "Be at Bellardice Enterprises in 1 hour." Roy's voice, no preamble, no explanation. 40th floor, conference room A. The line went dead. Kimberly sat on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking. This was it. Either Roy had seen the evidence and believed her, or Dominic had convinced him it was fabricated, and she was walking into a trap. William, still asleep on her couch, stirred slightly. She'd sent him home with the driver last night, but the boy had refused to leave until she promised she'd fix things. She'd kept that promise as best she could. Now it was up to Roy. Would you have the courage to walk back into the place that destroyed you, knowing it might finish the job? She got dressed, put on the same navy blazer she'd worn her first day, pulled her hair back, looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone different than the waitress who'd defended a scared boy 4 weeks ago. That woman had been surviving. This one was fighting back. The 40th floor was reserved for executive meetings, the kind where deals worth millions were made and broken over handshakes and implied threats. When Kimberly stepped off the elevator, a security guard she recognized nodded once and gestured toward the conference room. Through the glass walls, she could see them. Roy at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone. Dominic to his right, leaning back in his chair, with the relaxed confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. 4 other men, senior advisors, division heads, sat rigid and silent. The guard opened the door. Every head turned. Dominic's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Then it returned, sharp and poisonous. "Roy," he said smoothly, "I wasn't aware we'd invited the help." "Sit, Ms. Wallace," Roy said, ignoring him. There was one empty chair, directly across from Dominic. Kimberly walked to it, set down the folder she'd brought, and sat. Her heart hammered, but her hand stayed steady. Roy pressed a button on the table. The conference room door locked with a soft click. The glass walls tinted to opaque black. No one was leaving until this was finished. "Gentlemen," Roy began, his voice calm and cold, "we're here because I've uncovered a betrayal, one that goes back 18 months, one that cost me my wife." Dominic's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Ms. Wallace," Roy continued, "has prepared a presentation. I suggest you pay attention." He nodded to her. Kimberly opened the folder. 17 months ago, she began, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her, someone inside this organization began siphoning funds from Bellardice Enterprises, shell companies, offshore accounts, small transfers designed to avoid detection. She slid the first document across the table. Financial records, transaction histories. The thefts totaled $8.3 million. The transfers were authorized using high-level credentials and routed through intermediaries, including Robert White, a regional manager with no reason to have that kind of access. One of the advisors leaned forward, scanning the numbers. "Unless," Kimberly continued, "someone higher up was protecting him." Dominic's jaw tightened. "This is absurd. Roy, she's been discredited. Her own records were forged." Kimberly pulled out the next document. Metadata reports, IP logs. "The transfers used to frame me were created on a workstation I never accessed, using administrative overrides I don't have clearance for." She slid the papers toward Roy. "The actual user ID traces back to one person." She looked directly at Dominic. "You." The room went silent. Dominic laughed, a forced, brittle sound. "Metadata can be manipulated. You're a financial assistant, not a forensic analyst. This is—" "There's more," Kimberly said quietly. She placed a small audio player on the table and pressed play. Elena Bellardice's voice filled the room. "You stole from him, Dominic. From your own family. It's not stealing, it's compensation for 20 years of loyalty." The color drained from Dominic's face. The recording played on. The argument. The threats. The final terrifying moments on the bridge. "Family doesn't betray family, Elena. You betrayed us first." When the scream came, when the crash echoed through the speakers, one of the advisors flinched. Roy sat motionless, his hands flat on the table, his knuckles white. The recording ended. The silence that followed was suffocating. "That's—" Dominic's voice cracked. "That's fabricated, deepfake technology. It's easy to—" "The file was encrypted in Elena's personal archive," Roy said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "The one you didn't know existed. The one she kept as insurance." He stood slowly. "You killed my wife. You stole from my son's future. And you tried to destroy the one person loyal enough to find the truth." Dominic shot to his feet. "Roy, listen to me. 20 years I've stood beside you. 20 years you've been planning this." Roy's fury was terrifying precisely because it was so controlled. No shouting, no violence. just cold, absolute judgment. Strip him of his position, his accounts, his access, everything. Roy's gaze never left Dominic's face. And call Detective Morrison. Tell him we have evidence in a murder investigation. Security appeared at the door. 4 men, and expressionless. Dominic's desperation finally broke through. You can't do this? I built this empire with you. You built nothing. Roy's voice was ice and iron. You betrayed everything. Dominic lunged for the door. He didn't make it 3 steps. Security grabbed him, professional and efficient. He struggled, shouting threats and promises and excuses, but they dragged him out like the garbage he was. The door closed. The room exhaled. Roy turned to Kimberly. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Really looked, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. You could have run, he said quietly, taken the warning and disappeared. I don't run, Kimberly replied. Not from the truth. Something shifted in Roy's expression. Respect, gratitude, maybe even the beginning of redemption. Gentlemen, he said to the remaining advisors, meet your new chief financial officer. Kimberly's breath caught. Pending your acceptance, of course, Roy added, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Outside, Manhattan gleamed in the morning light. Justice, it turned out, didn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it came with evidence, courage, and one woman refusing to be silenced. What would you have done in Kimberly's position? Let us know in the comments. 6 months later, Vincent's diner looked like a different place. The cracked vinyl booths had been reupholstered in deep burgundy. The wobbly ceiling fan had been replaced with vintage fixtures that cast warm light across refinished, hardwood floors. The jukebox, fully restored, played Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald to customers who actually smiled at their servers. The sign outside still read Vincent's, but everyone knew who owned it now. Kimberly stood on the sidewalk, staring at the place that had changed her life, and felt the ghost of the woman she used to be, exhausted, afraid, barely surviving. That woman felt like a stranger now. Miss Kimberly! William's voice cut through her thoughts. He burst out of the black car at the curb, all 7 years of him vibrating with excitement. Can we sit at the same booth, please? Roy followed at a more measured pace, but there was something different about him, too. The hard edges had softened. He smiled more, touched his son's shoulder more, looked less like a man carrying the weight of an empire, and more like a father learning to live again. That's up to the lady, Roy said, his eyes meeting Kimberly's with warmth that still sometimes caught her off guard. She grinned. I think that can be arranged. Inside, the lunch rush hummed with comfortable energy. No shouting, no chaos. The new manager, a woman named Teresa who'd worked her way up from line cook, greeted them with genuine warmth. Mr. Bellardice, Ms. Wallace, and William. Teresa crouched down. I saved your favorite booth. William beamed and grabbed Kimberly's hand, pulling her toward the front window. The same booth, the one where a terrified boy had clutched a milkshake and a stranger had stepped between him and cruelty. Now it gleamed under afternoon sunlight, polished and peaceful. They slid in, William between Kimberly and Roy, exactly where he wanted to be. Chocolate milkshake? Teresa asked knowingly. With extra whipped cream, William said, then looked at his father. Please? Roy's expression softened. Just this once. You say that every time, William giggled. It was the sound of a child who'd learned to laugh again, who spoke freely now, who had nightmares less often, who was learning that the world could be safe. Kimberly's throat tightened. Teresa brought waters and menus, though none of them really needed to look. This wasn't about the food. I drew something for you, William announced, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. He smoothed it out on the table with careful hands. 3 figures, drawn in crayon. One tall man in a blue suit, one smaller woman with dark hair, one little boy in the middle. They were holding hands. Beneath it in wobbly letters, my family. Kimberly's vision blurred. She looked at Roy and saw him staring at the drawing with an expression that was equal parts grief and hope. It's perfect, Kimberly whispered. William tucked himself against her side, content. Roy cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was rough. I never properly thanked you. You gave me a job, Roy. You've thanked me plenty. No. He looked at her directly. You gave me my son back. You gave me a reason to be better than what I was. He paused. Elena would have liked you. She always said the measure of a person wasn't what they had, but what they'd risk for someone else. I didn't risk anything, Kimberly said quietly. You risked everything. Roy's gaze was steady. Your job, your safety, your life for the truth, for William, for people you barely knew. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I know we made it official weeks ago, but I wanted to do this here, where it started. He slid the envelope across. Chief Financial Officer, full partnership track. You're not just an employee anymore, Kimberly. You're family. The word hit her like sunlight breaking through clouds. Family. She opened the envelope. Inside, a contract, a set of keys, and a handwritten note in Roy's precise script. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite it. Thank you for reminding me what that means. RB. She looked up, tears threatening. Roy, Daddy says you're staying forever. William interrupted, looking up at her with those dark, earnest eyes. Are you? How could she say no to that face? To this broken, healing family that had somehow become hers? Yeah, sweetheart, she said, pulling him close. I'm staying. Roy's smile was small but genuine. He glanced around the diner, at the customers laughing, at the servers working without fear, at the place he'd bought and restored because it represented something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. This is where everything changed, he said quietly. Kimberly looked at the booth, at William's drawing, at the man who'd been a stranger in a blue suit and was now something close to redemption, personified. No, she said, smiling through tears. This is where it started. Outside, the city hummed with life. The Bellardis limousine waited at the curb, but for once there was no rush, no shadows, no urgency, just a father, a son, and the woman who'd reminded them both what it meant to be human. William's milkshake arrived, towering with whipped cream, and his delighted laugh filled the diner. Some empires are built on power, some are built on fear, but the ones that last, the ones that matter, are built on courage, loyalty, and the radical act of doing what's right when everything says to look away. Kimberly Wallace had walked into Vincent's diner 6 months ago as a waitress with nothing to lose. She walked out as the woman who'd changed everything. And in a booth by the window, under warm afternoon light, 3 people who'd found each other in the chaos learned what it meant to be whole. This is where their story transformed, from survival to purpose, from loneliness to belonging. If this journey moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that courage can change everything. Because sometimes standing up for what's right doesn't just save one person, it saves everyone.